Normally, when patch notes come out, I do like an exclusive YouTube video, and I don't cover the changes live like this, but since I'm planning on being live for most of the day, I won't have time to record this, so we're just going to do this now, and then I'll put the patch notes thoughts up on YouTube later as like a highlight. So, the short version in the dev notes is that they learned things during the beta, and they're kind of adjusting how they are going to be buffing and nerfing things going forward. It's a bit of an interesting read, but it doesn't really give you a lot of specifics. So I'm not going to cover, I think, this part. I would just say read it if you're interested, or don't. All right, card updates. Vladimir is getting a buff. So at level 2 now, it's going from, for each other attacking ally, you deal 1 to the enemy nexus, to now you deal 1 to your attacking allies, and then you drain 1 from the enemy nexus. So it's a little bit more on theme. You get that nice, like, blood-sucking Vlad. I don't know how I feel about this. You don't see a lot of competitive Vlad decks, and I don't know if this is going to be enough to put it over the top. Maybe it makes him a little more desirable in control. I mean, it's certainly one of the better ways to actually heal now in Noxus. Noxus as a region just doesn't have a lot of healing, so changing this to a drain might make him more palatable, but I'm just not 100% certain that this is enough to make him go from like meme status to even like tier 2 status. That's not to say you can't make Vlad decks work. I'm a firm believer you can make just about any deck work. It's just whether or not it's viable enough to climb. And I don't know this is enough. Karma. Cost is going from 5 to 6. That's it. Everything else is still the same. I don't think this impacts Karma decks a ton. I mean, if you've got nothing to do on 5 and you've got the extra Karma, or, you know, later on when you're trying to play her and have enough mana to protect her, maybe it starts to impact you there, but I think in terms of traditional play patterns, this will actually only impact games, I don't know, probably around the 10 to 15% of the time. Shen. Shen's getting a buff. Goes from 2 attack power to 3 attack power at level 1, and then because of the standard +1/+1 when you level up, it's gonna jump up to 4 attack power at level 2. I don't know that this is enough to make Shen super attractive either. Shen is in this interesting position where you traditionally pair Shen with Demacia because Demacia has big bodies. Demacia already has some barrier synergy, and obviously Fiora resides there, and the OG Fiora like combo deck featured Shen. But the reality is, when you think about Shen in Ionia as that package, giving your elusives barrier doesn't really help a ton. Playing Shen in your control Ionia decks doesn't feel correct because you have to attack with him, right? He's a support character. And so Shen struggles to find a home, I think, just because of where he resides, where he lives. There's not a lot of mid-range Ionia-based decks, and this change isn't going to change that fact. Ionia has like 2 identities. You've got your spell-based Ionia lists, whether that's Karma or Lee Sin, and then you've got your elusive-based decks. I don't see Shen fitting in either one of those. And the reality is, with the existence of Lee Sin now, like, I don't know of a time when you would ever choose Shen over Lee Sin. Now, you could play Shen with Lee Sin, perhaps, but Lee Sin's like already giving himself barrier. He does it all in one package, so I don't know. Shen gets a buff. I don't think this makes him suddenly see a lot of play. Vi gets a slight nerf. Health goes from 5 to 4. And so the level 2 also goes down by 1. This is fine. I honestly still think she'll see a lot of play. This just puts her more in line with, I think, other cards at her cost. Her stat line was a bit high. especially given the fact that she's got the tough keyword, right? Her toughness makes her very resilient, and with the number of ways that this game has to deal 1 damage to something, that was better than a single health stat point. So, I mean, this is a nerf. It will affect her, but the reality is, like, she'll still see play. Hecarim getting a buff. So Hecarim used to be the gold standard of 6 drops for a long time. Then it got nerfed, fell out of popularity. So they are returning a little bit of that power level, but in the form of their attack numbers, which I find to be really interesting. So it's going to be a 5/5 and then levels up to a 6/6. I don't know if this is going to be enough to see him become widely popular, but this is the sort of sneaky buff that actually might make him be relevant again, because his level 2 ability in the deck that it's designed to be in can be very potent. Like, it is a finisher. But I don't know that the 1 attack power is going to be enough to really push that over the top. Ultimately, your big issue here now is that people have caught on that, like, there are some really powerful 6 drops in the game, things like Cythria. And so whenever you're paying 6, you have to say, like, is this going to be as good as Cythria? A level 2 Hecarim, yeah, that's probably as good or better than a Cythria. A level 1 Hecarim, it's going to really depend on your board, because Cythria is going to give you better stats. You lose the keyword, but you get, you know, the blanket, like, you buff your squad, you give them a keyword thing. So I don't know. We'll see. But this is a semi-reasonable buff, if only because Hecarim just inherently has Overwhelm. Like, the 1 power is, I think, more relevant on Hecarim than other champions because of the fact that his keyword is Overwhelm. All right, more buffs. Great Horn Champion. Again, I think this is probably the most mispronounced card in the game because people say Great Thorn, but it's Great Horn Champion. I mean, look at these great horns, you know? Great Horn. Horn. Great. Anyway. This is now a 5/5. A 5/5 for 5 with Scout is kind of dangerous. This is going to be a buff to Remembrance, but it's honestly a buff to itself. I think before it was questionable whether you wanted to run it, but I think now it's worthy of competition with some of the other 5 drops. I think the thing that hurts it ultimately, though, is that it's not a great defensive option. So in theory, if there were an aggro Demacia deck that cared about something like this as its top end, then maybe you start running this. The problem is I don't think that exists. I think that even after some of these nerfs we'll see in a bit, Demacia is still ultimately going to be a mid-range value deck, in which case the other 5 drops in Demacia will beat this out. Because when you're talking about 5 in Demacia, you have to be, you know, if you're trying to win a slot in a deck, you have to be better than Garen at something, which would be survivability. This is not. You have to be better than the challenging unit. So again, Demacia doesn't have great removal. That subs in as like your top end kind of removal in the form of challenge. This card doesn't help you there. When you start talking about sustainability, right? Radiant is a card that looks pretty good. This doesn't beat Radiant in that category. So really, like, this is a nice aggressive card, but there's just better aggressive decks, and Demacia doesn't normally fit that bill. So where it might start fitting in would be, you know, you could say like Scout decks, but you're already running Quinn usually in that slot. So I don't know. We'll see. I think this will be great for expeditions, but Demacia didn't need any help in expeditions. So I don't know. All right, Grizzled Ranger goes from a 4/1 to a 3/1, which I think is fine. It's going to get a double nerf because you'll kind of see down here, Loyal Badger Bear also is catching a nerf, but I think this is reasonable. This card is also still going to see play at this cost, in my opinion. It's just going to be less effective. This is still kind of an insane card. Laurent Chevalier, however you pronounce it. Laurent here is now a 3/2. So they talk about the dream of getting him multiple triggers is now easier because of the 2 health, and that again is very real. There's certain thresholds that are very important in Runeterra. Going from 1 health to 2 is huge because the number of ways to deal 1 damage is very high in this game. And then the other spots are where you're going from like 3 to 4, because that's where you start to become like the mythical immortal. You're not really immortal, but like the idea that the number of things that just directly take you out shrink significantly when you go from 3 health to 4 health. So this helps with that first threshold for sure. I don't know if it's going to see a lot of play because there's just not a lot of Demacia control decks. And outside of control decks, this card I don't think has a home. And there's just better stuff that you can do in mid-range decks when you're trying to get value. And it's not really an aggressive card, so maybe if some Demacian control list starts springing up, I could see it seeing play. You could get a lot of value there. I just don't know what that deck is right now. You know, if Judgment becomes popular again, we'll see. Loyal Badger Bear is now a 3-cost 3/4. So Young Mammoth has died. Now we're just on to a normal 3/4. And honestly, this card's still good. But I like this change a lot because when this card got printed as a 4/4, you basically took Laurent Protégé and deleted it from the game. That card, Laurent Protégé, used to be a legitimate card in a lot of decks, and it has seen 0 play as a result of Badger Bear coming into existence. This at least makes it closer because now you're like, okay, I can sacrifice 1 attack for Challenger. That might be worth it. But just straight up 2 extra attack power, you were out of your mind to run Protégé before. So I like this nerf. I think this is fair. Again, I don't think this is really going to hurt Demacia too much. Standalone gets a bit of a nerf, goes up to 4. And really, this is just about making it so that the 3 spell mana, 3-cost Zed into standalone plays aren't happening on turn 3. It's delayed a turn for the combo decks. The reality is standalone's still really strong in a standalone deck, but slowing them down even by 1 turn is pretty relevant because they're basically like a OTK combo deck. So I think this is reasonable. I think it's fair. Legion Rearguard. This is a pretty significant nerf to this card. Going from a 3/2 to a 3/1 is a big deal. And there's a strong chance this ends up being cut from a number of aggressive decks as a result. It can't block. It doesn't get you the guaranteed damage that the counterpart does, right? The Saboteur. Saboteur is a 2/1, but also gets the damage on the Nexus, and that's far more relevant in aggressive decks. So, I don't know. This is a legitimate nerf to this card. This could very much affect its play rate. I mean, it's still strong, but as I was saying earlier, the number of ways to deal 1 damage is significantly higher than the number of ways to deal 2 damage. So this is a pretty big hit. Kindly Tavern Keeper. It's now a 3/3 for 3, and you heal your Nexus for 3. So you get the trifecta of 3s. This would be relevant if Freljord Control was relevant. The problem is that it's not right now. So, I don't know. I don't know that this is going to matter a ton. Some folks might experiment with this. It should pop up every now and then. It will likely matter a bit in expeditions if you do end up going Freljord, but Freljord's in a bit of a rough spot, and the decks that I do think are still good with Freljord right now don't include Tavern Keeper, so this doesn't help them much. Deep Meditation. I like this nerf a lot, so it goes from 4 to 5, but the reason that I like it is because this was almost a 0 drawback, like draw 2, but even more than just draw 2, it was also kind of pseudo search because it was 2 specific cards and that you were drawing spells. So when you would compare this to something like Salvage, for example, or similar cards, this card seemed incredibly strong at 4 mana, and then also going down to potentially 2 seemed bonkers. Like absolutely bonkers. So I'm completely fine with this change. I think the decks that run this will likely still run it, but it might not be an auto include 3 of anymore, or at least you have to really try to get the value and not try to pay 5 for it. Boom Crew Rookie. 4 health down to 3 health. This is a bigger nerf than it looks. As I said before, that threshold between 3 and 4 health is a very big deal. Now, that being said, this card is still going to see the exact same amount of play in the decks that were already running it because it's still that good. Like, ultimately, the aggressive decks that run Boom Crew care far more about the Nexus damage than anything else, and the only thing that happens is now when you swing with this, if somebody has that 3-2, it blocks and kills this, where before it didn't, and so you're likely only getting 2 damage out of this as opposed to getting 4 or more like you did before. So it's a pretty sizable nerf, but I think that the play rate for this probably stays the same in the decks that run it. Brood Awakening. It's interesting. I was just thinking about this card earlier today. So this got buffed a while ago, and the buff has now been reverted. It used to cost 6, now it costs 5, now it's back to 6. And I think, just like when it cost 6, this card might just be dead. 5, it's so weird. Like, 5 is that sweet spot where it just feels strong enough that you can actually run it, because it's evenly matched with something like Withering Wail. But the minute it goes back to 6, the last thing you want to do is pay more mana for a slower spell that's risky to run into somebody's Withering Wail, or now with the presence of cards like Make It Rain and etc. Like, you can lose a lot of value when you play this, and spiders are all but dead because of the number of like 1 damage wide area of effect spells. So this was really only played in like They Who Endure decks. That deck might still run this because it's a bit slower, but outside of that deck, like, I don't see this being played a whole lot. Maybe Karina, like, I don't know. The 2 decks that run this, it's funny because I think they wanted to do this to make it less effective in control, but like, I think it's more likely to only be played in control decks at 6 than 5. Like, all you did is make this no longer even potentially used in aggressive decks, in my opinion. I don't know. We'll see on this card, but that's pretty rough. Longtooth. So in other words, for Chum the Waters and Fizz's Chum the Waters, gets a bit of a buff here. The health goes from 1 to 2. This is a pretty legitimate card now. Chum the Waters, I wasn't running, and I would barely ever play it if I had Fizz and like I drew the second one. Like, I'd rather just save the Fizz as insurance for if the first one dies, but also they've bug fixed it where you can play Chum the Waters if there's not an enemy unit in play, which is huge. But 5-2 with Overwhelm is a reasonable stat line just for like aggressive decks. Bilgewater, specifically because of the Overwhelm. So if you play Chum the Waters and you get to attack, this is very likely to be triggering your plunder effects. I almost said pilfer. Good old Test Legends coming back. But the plunder effects and things like that getting triggers, making sure that you're leveling up your Gangplank if you're running him in that style deck. Like, this is actually pretty legitimate now. Monkey Idol. This goes from 4 health to 5 health, giving you the opportunity to maybe get 3 triggers instead of 2 triggers. I don't think this sees any extra play as a result. Has this card even seen play? I have legitimately never had this played against me since the expansion. I don't think this changes that. Like, I just don't. All right. The last one here is Slotbot. This is a huge buff to a card that was already kind of secretly good. So I am very curious to see how this works out. The only reason I think this is getting a buff is because some of the buff cards themselves were getting nerfed, but Slotbot goes from a 0-3 to a 1-4. So if you're not familiar, at round start, he gets +0/+1 for each card you drew last round. Then shuffle my stats. So he can buff himself by you drawing cards. He can also be the target of buffs, But the important thing here with the shuffle stats is that if he takes a lot of damage and he gets low on health next turn, he might lose power, but his health can shoot back up and then he gets value again. So this card has the potential to just like hit the board and be around forever. And I know that people stay away from this because it's a randomized effect, but this card is like kind of reaching dangerous territory. The buff of this magnitude is on par with when Boom Crew Rookie went from a 0-4 to a 1-4. I very much expect to see more slot bot as a result of this buff. And I know that I'm going to brew with this when it hits. And then lastly, we have the watch list. So they mentioned Unyielding Spirit. They talk about it being contentious and that it offers unique challenges in adjusting as quick numbers change is more likely to push it out of playability rather than addressing any core issues. So I think what they're trying to say is like if they make it cost 9 or 10, they run the risk of it like seeing the exact same amount of play, in which case you've done nothing, or just killing the card and no in between. And then when you talk about like potential answers in other areas, here's my thing on Unyielding Spirit. I know this card can be very unsatisfying to play against. It reminds me a lot of Ledros when the game launched. Everyone said like Ledros was pretty terrible to play against because it felt like there was nothing you could do against it. And then over time, people just started realizing like there were plenty of ways to address it. So I don't know. I feel like over time, people are going to become more aware of, one, how to play around it. And then even more so, like as it's not an immediate fix by any means, but as we get more cards printed, there will be more cards that deal with it. So I think watch list makes sense for now. Pilfered goods and card stealing. They talk about it being frustrating. I mean, I called this when these cards were revealed just because I said, hey, if you come from the Elder Scrolls Legends, this was the single most hated thing like in the game. You know, I mentioned Thieves Guild Shadowfoot. So I'm not surprised this is on the watch list. And then they also mention Nexus damage and Karma and Ezreal. So Karma, I think that they're still keeping this combo on the watch list largely because Karma is getting a small adjustment, but the reality is I think that this deck is one of those ones that if aggro doesn't exist in the meta, it becomes dominant. We'll see if the changes to aggro were enough to push the burn deck completely out. And make no mistake, I think right now there's not any good aggro decks. Not true aggro. I think all the best aggro decks are burn related because the tools against non-burn aggro are too strong. Like, with the addition of what Bilgewater brought, traditional aggro is in a really rough spot, in my opinion. So if burn is dead, then this deck could become a monster again. And if burn is not dead, then it kind of keeps it in check. But the reality is traditional aggro still needs a lot of help. And then they also, again, on that same note, they talk about Nexus damage just kind of in general. So I don't know. That's it for the notes, though. My quick analysis, because I said it earlier on the stream, but my quick analysis is I'm fine with pretty much all of these changes, but the reality is I also don't see anything that jumps out at me and says that there's a clear winner. Besides something like Deep. Deep went basically untouched, and it was already a pretty powerful deck list, and I don't see that going away anytime soon, like the nice refined Deep lists anyway. But if their goal was like deck diversity, I don't look at any of these and say like, oh, now Yasuo's suddenly viable. Oh, now I want to play a Shen deck. You know, hey, look, Freljord got the help it needed. You're going to see a lot of people who praise these patch notes because I think a lot of these changes are pretty kind of like common sense, but the reality is I don't think this does much for opening up deck building. I don't look at anything here and say like, hey, this deck that I really wanted to play but I was unable to before is now magically more playable because of these changes. So I don't know. We'll see. I think that a lot of the really popular decks got hit in terms of power level, and their play rates might shuffle as a result. Like, Burn might be played less, maybe Demacia is played less, and then maybe Ezreal decks become popular again as a result. But the reality is, like, the decks that are meta now are still going to be meta tomorrow, and their win rates are just going to shuffle around a bit. Like, that's my analysis from this patch. I legitimately don't see anything here and say, hey, wow, there's now this magic deck that was held back that is now suddenly playable. Like Swain decks, for example. Like if you're a big Swain person, Swain's as viable tomorrow as it is today. Because not much has really changed here. Your Yasuo decks are still going to be bad. Your Shen decks, even with the buff, are still not going to be good enough, right? So that's my patch analysis. Maybe this is the most important thing to mention, is Rainbow Poro. And the arcade board. This arcade board is fantastic. By the way, like, this is fantastic. Also, some new emotes. Draven, Elise, Teemo. I actually kind of really love the Teemo one. I don't know what its intent was, but when I look at this says I'm praying for a top deck. Right? Arcade card back. And then expedition changes. I don't normally highlight these in my patch notes because the reality is, more often than not, when you're playing for expedition, you're caring far more about your choices at any given time. So knowing, just for example, that like when you're shown a relentless combo of cards in, you know, your expedition, knowing that these changed, I don't think is that big of a deal. You're still going to be looking at the cards, right? So I think just going over the actual card changes is far more relevant than the actual package changes as far as expeditions go, but I don't normally cover those when I talk about patch notes either. So anyway, that's gonna wrap this part up where I'm talking, I guess, to the recording side. Like I said, I'm doing this live, and I don't normally do this live, but this is where I'm gonna like end the YouTube video portion, and then I'm just gonna talk about changes with chat. So, you know, if you made it this far and you're watching this on YouTube, thanks for watching.